Zayn Whitaker had only been a poor night shift security guard at Sterling Gate Technologies, a single father who often let his 6-year-old daughter doze off in the guard booth because there was no one else to watch her. That morning, Chief Executive Adelaide Monroe coldly drove him out of the demonstration floor in front of her engineers and said, "You were hired to hold the door, not to stand near my system." 10 minutes later, the $40 million demonstration collapsed. The security doors locked solid, the rescue robots froze mid-stride, and Zayn's daughter was trapped behind a wall of glass. The only person in the building who understood what was actually happening was the man the chief executive had just shamed. The morning began under a low, overcast sky, the kind that follows a long night of soft rain. The headquarters of Sterling Gate Technologies rose from the wet pavement like something cut out of a magazine, all polished glass and brushed steel, its metal logo catching the cold blue light of the lobby lamps. Inside, every surface seemed designed to remind a visitor that this place belonged to people who built systems, signed contracts, and trusted the hum of clean machines. At the main entrance stood Zayn Whitaker, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, his uniform shirt faded from too many washes, and his shoes polished so often the leather had gone thin at the toe. He was tall and quietly handsome in a tired way, the kind of man who had clearly carried more weight than his 29 years should have asked of him. He did not slouch, did not check his phone, did not lean on the counter. He simply stood there, watching the doors, watching the people, watching the morning happen without him. Inside the small guard room beside the lobby, Matilda Whitaker sat on a plastic chair with her legs swinging just above the tile. She was 6 years old, her light brown hair still soft with sleep, her yellow sweater a little too big for her shoulders. In her lap she held a gray stuffed rabbit, one of its long ears stitched back on with white thread. On the table beside her sat a small carton of milk, 2 crackers wrapped in a paper napkin, and a coloring book she had not opened yet. Whenever Zayn glanced back through the glass partition, she straightened up and tried to look like the kind of child no one would mind seeing in an office building. The first wave of employees came through the doors, badges swinging from their lanyards. A man in a charcoal suit slid his card across the scanner without looking up. A woman in heels balanced 2 coffees and let Zayn reach across to hold the door open with his foot. A middle manager set his paper cup down on Zayn's counter, as though it were a side table, finished a phone call, picked the cup back up, and walked away without a word. Zayn did not flinch, did not sigh, did not even change the line of his mouth. He simply made a quick mental note of each face, each badge, each sound, the way another man might count breaths. What none of them knew, as they hurried past the man in the faded uniform, was that he understood the system inside that building better than anyone wearing a suit on the executive floor. A few minutes after 8, Zayn walked his slow circuit through the side corridor that ran behind the service elevator. He had walked the route hundreds of times, but this morning his steps slowed near a maintenance panel mounted into the wall. From inside the panel came a faint, dry buzz, no louder than a moth against a bulb. It lasted about a second, then vanished. Most people would have walked past it without ever turning their heads. Zayn stopped, tilted his head, and listened to the silence that followed. Then he glanced at his watch, took out a small black notebook, and wrote in careful block letters, 7:42. Buzz at East Service Panel. Matches service elevator load cycle. He did not radio anyone. He did not call the engineering floor. He simply closed the notebook and slid it back into his pocket, the way a man might mark a small change in a familiar river. Constance Reed, the chief executive's assistant, came around the corner just then, tablet in one hand, badge swinging from the other. She was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and watchful in a way that the rest of the executive floor often missed. She caught the small motion of Zayn closing his notebook and slowed her stride. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, half-teasing, "do you really write down the noises this building makes?" Zayn offered her a small, tired smile. "Some sounds are just noise," he said quietly. "Other sounds are warnings the system gives before it starts lying to you." Constance held his gaze for a half-second longer than the moment required. The line did not match the man she had assumed she was speaking to. Before she could ask anything more, her tablet buzzed and her name was being called from the upper floor. She gave him a small nod, then walked on, her heels tapping briskly across the polished tile. Back at the booth, Matilda looked up as her father came in and rubbed her eyes with the heel of one small hand. "What was the noise, Daddy?" she asked. Zayn crouched in front of her chair, pushed a strand of hair back behind her ear, and tucked the gray rabbit more firmly into the crook of her arm. "Just the building coughing a little, sweetheart," he said. "Nothing to worry about." She smiled, satisfied, and went back to coloring a yellow sun in the corner of her book. By 8:15, the lobby had begun to change shape. Floor staff carried folding partitions toward the demonstration hall. Caterers wheeled trays of glass water bottles past the front desk. Two engineers in matching navy polos walked through with toolboxes, arguing softly about voltage tolerances. The chief executive of Sterling Gate Technologies was on her way down, and the building seemed to hold its breath in preparation. Adelaide Monroe stepped out of the executive elevator at exactly 8:30. She was 28 years old, strikingly poised, her chestnut hair falling past the shoulders of an ivory dress cut in a clean V at the collar. She did not smile at the staff who straightened as she passed. She did not need to. Her presence rearranged the room the way a magnet rearranges iron filings, all on its own. Behind her came Bernie Wallace, the lead engineer of the LifeGate program. He was in his early 40s, square-jawed and confident, the kind of man whose certainty had carried him from one promotion to the next. He had spent 11 months on this project. He had run the simulations. He had signed the readiness report. As far as Bernie Wallace was concerned, the morning was already a victory. LifeGate Emergency Response had been described to investors as the next generation of building safety. In the case of fire, intrusion, medical emergency, or active threat, the system would isolate the danger zone, open clear evacuation paths, deploy small rescue robots through the corridors, signal first responders, and protect every person inside the building until help arrived. It connected cameras, smart locks, service elevators, backup power, sensors, and a central command interface into a single network that was supposed to think faster than any human team. Today's demonstration would put it in front of the City Council's safety board, 2 hospital network directors, and a panel of federal investors. If the morning went well, Sterling Gate Technologies would close a $40 million contract, and Adelaide Monroe would walk away as one of the most talked-about young chief executives in the field. In the staging area behind the main hall, Adelaide turned to Bernie with one perfectly level question. "Is there anything in this building," she asked, "that can make me look foolish today?" Bernie did not even pause. "No, ma'am," he said. "If anything goes wrong out there, it will be a human error. Not the system." Zayn was passing through the staging area at that moment with a stack of clipboards for the sign-in desk. He heard the line but did not slow. He only glanced once toward the eastern corridor, where the maintenance panel had buzzed an hour earlier, and then continued on his way. By 9 o'clock, the demonstration hall was full. Investors and council members took their seats in a low half-circle of chairs facing a glass-walled corridor mock-up that had been built right inside the building. Cameras were mounted in the ceiling. 2 small white rescue robots waited like patient dogs at the corridor's end. A bank of monitors lined the back wall, ready to mirror every reading the system produced. Adelaide stepped up to the small lectern, smiled the careful smile she reserved for cameras, and began to speak about the future of safety. While she spoke, Matilda grew restless in the booth. She had been good for a long time, she felt, and the chair was hard, and her milk was finished. The gray rabbit slipped out of her lap and rolled gently across the floor toward the corridor that led to the demonstration hall. Matilda gasped, slid down from the chair, and padded after it on quiet feet. The rabbit had been her mother's last gift. She could not let it go any farther than her arms could reach. She bent to pick it up just as the heavy doors at the end of the corridor swung open, and the executive party stepped through. Adelaide stopped mid-step. Bernie almost walked into her shoulder. Constance, just behind them, drew in a sharp little breath. Two investors slowed and stared. In the middle of the hallway, a small girl in a yellow sweater held a stuffed rabbit by one stitched ear and looked up with frightened eyes at the most powerful woman in the building. Zayn was already moving. He came down the corridor at a fast walk, careful not to run, and dropped to one knee beside his daughter. "It's all right, sweetheart," he said softly, his voice pitched only for her. "I'm here. You're not in trouble." He picked up the rabbit, smoothed its mended ear, and pressed it back into her hands. Then he looked up at the chief executive, and his face went very still. "Miss Monroe," he said, "I apologize. She slipped past me. It won't happen again." Adelaide did not soften. She looked at the worn cuffs of his uniform shirt, at the small girl at his knee, at the rabbit pressed against the child's chest, and her mouth tightened into a thin, controlled line. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, and her voice carried up the corridor without effort, "I understand you have a personal situation, but this is not a daycare. This company is hours away from a $40 million demonstration. I expect a clean hallway. I expect a quiet floor. I expect a professional environment." "Yes, ma'am," Zayn said. "It won't happen again." She did not stop there. "You were hired to hold the door," she said, "not to turn the executive corridor into a babysitting service." The line landed in the corridor like a dropped tray. Two investors looked away. Constance's eyes flicked to the floor. Bernie almost smiled, then caught himself. Matilda did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone, and she understood that the beautifully dressed woman was angry because of her. She tucked the rabbit behind her back as if her own arms could hide the shame, and she stared down at her shoes. Zayn felt the ache go through him in one long, silent wave. He could carry being looked through. He could carry being talked over. What he could not carry was the small bend in his daughter's shoulders, the way she had just learned, in the middle of a polished hallway, that her existence might be a problem for her father. He laid one large hand on the top of her head, breathed once, and answered without any heat at all. "Understood, ma'am," he said. "I'll take her back to the booth." Adelaide held his eyes for one cold second, then turned on her heel and led the executive party past them. Bernie glanced over his shoulder as he passed, with the smallest smile of a man who had just watched the floor be cleared in his favor. Constance was the last to walk by. She did not look at Zayn directly, but as she passed Matilda, she touched the corner of the little girl's sleeve, very lightly, and kept walking. In the booth, Zayn lifted Matilda onto the chair, knelt in front of her, and waited until she met his eyes. "Listen to me, baby," he said. "What that lady said wasn't about you. Do you understand? You didn't do anything wrong. The rabbit got away. You were brave to go after him." Matilda nodded once, but 2 tears slid down her cheeks anyway. She wiped them with the back of one small wrist, and tried very hard not to be a problem. The demonstration began at 9:30 sharp. The lights in the mock corridor dimmed to amber. A simulated smoke alert flashed across the central monitor. The 2 small rescue robots whirred to life, rolled forward in clean coordinated arcs, and began to map the corridor. The smart locks on the demonstration doors clicked into position, holding the danger zone closed while opening a clear path along the safe wall. The investors leaned forward in their chairs. One of the council members nodded slowly, impressed. Bernie allowed himself a single quiet exhale. In the back of the hall, Zayn stood with his arms folded against the wall, technically present only to support security during the event. He watched the monitors, but he did not watch them the way the engineers did. He watched the small things. A side camera at the far end of the corridor went dark for exactly 3 seconds, then came back. A secondary door took half a beat longer to seat its bolt than the others. One of the rescue robots paused, almost imperceptibly, the moment its fast-charging cradle in the side bay drew its highest current. To the audience, none of it registered. To Zayn, the pattern was already a sentence being whispered through the building. He looked across the hall at the eastern corridor, then down at his watch. The pattern was coming through at the same rhythm as the buzz he had heard at 7:42, only now the building was carrying full demonstration load. Bernie, glancing at the readings on the back wall, leaned toward Adelaide and murmured that small lag in a live demonstration environment was within tolerance. Adelaide nodded, her shoulders easing for the first time that morning. The audience could not see what Zayn could see, and Zayn did not yet have the standing to make them look. By the second cycle of the demonstration, the side camera dropped out for 4 seconds instead of 3. The secondary door's lag was a full beat now. The right-hand rescue robot stuttered as it rolled past the charging cradle, then corrected. Zayn felt the back of his neck go cool. He looked toward Constance, who was standing quietly to the left of the executive party, and chose her over the chief executive on purpose. He crossed the room with deliberate calm, and lowered his voice when he reached her. "Miss Reed," he said, "you should have someone check the auxiliary line on the eastern panel. That system is not lagging. It is being interfered with." Constance turned her head sharply. "Interfered with by what?" "By the robot's fast-charge bay or the service elevator under load," Zayn said. "The lock circuit is reading the noise as if someone were cutting a door." Adelaide caught the last words from a few feet away, and the temperature in her face dropped at once. She stepped forward, smile still in place for the audience, voice no longer warm. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "is there a problem?" Zayn straightened. He kept his voice low and respectful. "Ma'am, I don't want to interrupt the demonstration. But if you have someone check the ground line on the rescue robot charger, you can get ahead of a lockout." Bernie laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You're telling me," he said, "that our system has a problem because of a charger?" "I'm telling you," Zayn said evenly, "the system is running too many layers at once. If the auxiliary power isn't clean, the lock sensors can read it as a tamper signal." Bernie's smile widened, and not kindly. "And where exactly did you pick up that theory?" "In a weekend course for guards." A few staff members within earshot let out small, careful laughs. Matilda was standing in the doorway of the booth across the corridor, still holding the gray rabbit, and she heard everyone laugh at her father. Adelaide made the worst decision of her morning. She did not investigate, did not pause, did not even hesitate. She simply shut him down in front of the executive floor with the kind of calm cruelty that careers are sometimes built on. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I do not need a man who watches the front door to explain technology to my engineering team. Take your daughter back to the booth. Now." Zayn looked once at Matilda, saw the flush rising in her cheeks, and chose his daughter. He gave the chief executive a single short nod. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked back to the booth, took Matilda's hand, and led her toward the side corridor. He did not look back. They were halfway down the hall. Matilda's small fingers wrapped around 2 of his, when the rabbit slipped from her arm again. She tugged her hand free without thinking, turned, and ran 3 steps back to pick it up. At that moment, somewhere deep in the building's nervous system, the LifeGate program crossed an invisible line. The ground noise, the false tamper readings, the repeated rejection of the engineer's commands, all of it tipped past a threshold Bernie Wallace had not designed for. The system decided it was under attack. The corridor doors slammed shut. Heavy security glass dropped from a ceiling track between Zayn and his daughter with a single hard crack. The amber lights flipped to a hard, pulsing red. A loud emergency tone began to wail through the corridors. In the demonstration hall behind them, the simulated booth froze. The rescue robots locked in place mid-stride. The service elevator stopped between floors. The central monitor turned a deep red and printed a single line in white capitals. "Unauthorized override detected. Emergency lockdown engaged." Matilda spun in place. The rabbit clutched in both arms, and saw her father on the wrong side of the glass. "Daddy," she said, very small. Zayn was already on his knees. He did not throw himself at the glass. He did not pound on it. He pressed one open palm against the cold surface at exactly the height of her hand, and waited until she lifted her own to meet his. "Look at me, baby," he said, his voice cutting clearly through the alarm. "Don't look at the lights. Don't look at the red. Look at Daddy. We're going to count together, all right? 1, 2, and 3. With me." Read door. She matched his lips through the glass, her own lips trembling. 5, she whispered. In the demonstration hall, the audience had gone silent. A council member half rose from his chair, then sat back down. 2 investors looked at each other. Bernie Wallace was already shouting at the engineering bench. Adelaide stood very still, her ivory dress bright against the red light, and watched the small girl in the corridor through the glass partition. The world she had built that morning had just locked her best demonstration around someone else's child. Bernie's first instinct was to reset. He ordered an engineer to kill the demonstration coordinator and reboot the central interface. The screens flickered, then came back with the same warning. He ordered another engineer to override the corridor doors from the master panel. The screens responded by flashing the alert again, longer this time. He ordered a hard reset of the rescue robots. The system answered by deepening the lockdown. Each command they sent looked, to Lifegate, like another attempt to break in. "How long?" Adelaide asked quietly, her eyes still on Matilda. 2 minutes, Bernie said, fingers flying. 2 minutes passed. Nothing changed. The alarm kept screaming. Matilda's voice was beginning to break. "How long, Bernie?" Adelaide asked again, and now her voice had a very different edge. Bernie did not answer. The certainty that had carried him through 11 months of meetings was draining out of his face in real time. His simulations had been clean. His lab tests had passed. He was a good engineer in a good lab, and the building was no longer a lab. Zayn was still on his knees in front of the glass, but his eyes had begun to move. He watched the cycle of the red lights along the ceiling. He listened for the deep mechanical groan of the service elevator trying to draw current and being cut off. He watched the reflection of the back wall of monitors in the glass between him and his daughter. He saw the pattern lock into a clean rhythm in his head. Every time the rescue robots tried to reboot through the fast charge cradle, the side camera dropped. Every time the service elevator pulled load, the doors registered another tamper. Every time Bernie's team pushed a reset, the system buried itself one layer deeper. Zayn stood. He crossed the corridor in 3 strides, stepped into the demonstration hall, and spoke just loudly enough to carry. "Stop the resets," he said. No one heard him at first. Bernie was barking new instructions. An engineer was already keying a fresh override. "Stop the resets," Zayn said again, louder this time. Bernie wheeled on him. "You don't have authority on this floor." "No," Zayn said. "But my daughter is on the other side of a door that you can't open. And every time you push that command, you make it harder." The room went quiet. Even the alarm seemed to retreat in the hush that followed. Adelaide turned her body fully toward him for the first time that day. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, in a voice that had stripped itself of every layer of polish, "what do you think is happening?" Zayn pointed at the back wall of monitors, his hand steady. "The side camera goes dark every time the robot charger pulls peak load," he said. "The doors lock harder every time the service elevator pulls under current. The intrusion warning fires every time your team sends a reset. This is not an artificial intelligence problem. This is noise riding the ground line, and the lock sensors are reading it as someone forcing the doors." Bernie's jaw set. "That's impossible. We tested every subsystem." "That's the problem," Zayn said quietly. "You tested every subsystem alone. The fault only shows up when the robots, the elevator, the cameras, and the emergency locks all run together." The line was logical enough, and respectful enough, that it did not turn the engineers into fools. It only turned them into a team that had been looking at the wrong layer. Adelaide looked at her daughter through the glass. She looked at Bernie. She looked at the red warning still blinking on the central monitor. She thought, very briefly, of her own line in the corridor an hour earlier, the one about a daycare. Her stomach turned. "Stop the resets," she said. Bernie blinked. "Ma'am, stop the resets, Bernie," she said. "Right now." She turned back to Zayn. "Can you open that door?" "Yes," Zayn said. "But from this point on, no one touches the master panel until I say so." For a single charged second, no one moved. Then Adelaide nodded. "Do whatever you need to do." Zayn moved. He gestured to Constance. "I'll need someone at the auxiliary panel. Read me what I tell you to read." Constance fell in beside him without a word, tablet ready. They moved fast through the side corridor, past the still-locked glass where Matilda had pressed both hands flat against the surface. Zayn laid his palm against the glass once as he passed and held her eyes. "Almost, baby," he said. Almost. The auxiliary technical room sat at the end of the eastern corridor, behind a plain gray door most engineers had not opened in months. Inside, an old wall map of the building's electrical mains hung above a pair of metal cabinets, one of them holding the manual lock controls and the other carrying the service breakers. Zayn crossed to the breaker cabinet, traced a line on the map with one finger, and exhaled once when his finger reached the rescue robot charging bay. "There?" he said softly. "Look." He opened the cabinet. Inside, the high-current charging bay for the rescue robots had been wired into the auxiliary line through a temporary jumper. The jumper was clean enough to pass a quick inspection, but it shared a ground path with the lock sensor array, a path that would never have been chosen by anyone designing the building from scratch. "They wired the fast charger in at the last minute," Zayn said. "Probably to make the demonstration run on time. It's not wrong on paper. But under full load, the noise from the charger rides this ground line straight into the lock sensors. The system thinks someone is forcing the doors. Every reset only makes it more sure." "What do you need?" Constance asked. "Read me the status codes on panel 3, Zayn said in order, one at a time. She did. He listened. He worked. He isolated the rescue robot charging line, dropping it cleanly off the auxiliary feed. He switched the emergency lock circuits over to their manual backup, the way every serious safety system in the world is supposed to allow when its smart layer becomes unreliable. He keyed a shutdown command into the auxiliary cabinet that asked the demonstration hall to stop sending any new instructions, and waited until the monitors in the next room showed the request had been received. Then he reset the system in reverse order, the way a man rebuilds a house one quiet wall at a time. Auxiliary locks first. Side cameras second. Rescue robots last. In the demonstration hall, the back wall of monitors slowed its angry blinking. The deep red faded to a steadier amber. The intrusion warning text vanished from the central screen. The side camera in the corridor came back online and stayed on. The service elevator's tortured groaning eased into silence. The heavy security glass between Zayn and Matilda clicked once, a small mechanical sound under the alarms, and slid up into its ceiling track. Zayn was already running. He came around the corner from the auxiliary corridor at full speed, dropped to his knees on the polished tile, and caught his daughter as she launched herself into his chest. He folded both arms around her and pressed his face into her hair. Her small body shook against him in soft, thankful sobs. He did not look up at the executive party. He did not look at the audience. He did not look at the cameras in the ceiling. He held his daughter, and he picked up the gray rabbit from the floor where it had fallen, and he tucked it back under her arm. "You did so good, baby," he said. "You did so good." The hall behind them was very still. Bernie Wallace stood at the engineering bench with his hands flat against the surface, staring at a screen that was no longer screaming at him. He did not look angry. He only looked like a man who had just understood in front of every person he cared about impressing that he had been measuring a building from inside a room. Adelaide Munro had not moved from her place at the lectern. The ivory dress was the same. The chestnut hair was the same. The careful posture was the same. But the woman inside it was not. She was watching a father on his knees in a corridor she had ordered cleared, with a small child in his arms, and she was hearing her own voice say, "You were hired to hold the door," on a loop she could not turn off. The investors did not leave. They wanted, instead, to understand. A council member asked, very politely, what had just happened. Bernie tried to begin the explanation, faltered, and looked at Adelaide. Adelaide turned to the room and made the choice she had been so close to refusing to make. "We discovered an interference fault under full integrated load," she said, her voice clear. It was not visible in subsystem testing, because it only appeared when every layer of the system ran at once. "The man who identified that fault and who restored the building is our security officer, Mr. Zayn Whitaker." She said his name. She did not say the guard. She did not say the man at the door. She said his name and the name of the post she had hired him into, and the room shifted, very slightly the way a room shifts when truth arrives a few minutes late, but arrives anyway. "A council member? Curious," asked Zayn where he had trained. Zayn stood up, his daughter still pressed against his side, and answered without showing off. He had spent several years, he said, in a private defense facility, working on smart lock arrays, motion sensors, and emergency power circuits. He had left that work after his wife died, because the schedule had not allowed him to be the kind of father a small girl could count on. He had taken the security post at Sterling Gate Technologies because the hours let him keep her close. He did not say it as a complaint. He did not say it as a brag. He said it as a man explains why he chose a smaller life over a louder one. The room went quiet again, but it was a different quiet. Adelaide's eyes did not leave him. The line she had used in the corridor, the one about the door, finished its loop in her head and went silent at last. The next morning, Adelaide Munro gathered every employee in the lobby. It was the same lobby where Zayn had stood in his faded uniform the day before, opening the doors for people who would not look at his face. She wore a black dress in the same clean V-cut she favored, but her hair was simpler, and her face had lost the high gloss of the demonstration. She did not stand on a lectern. She stood on the polished floor, at the same level as the people around her, and she spoke without notes. "I was wrong," she said. "I judged a man by his uniform, by his title, and by the fact that he had a small daughter who needed him. Yesterday, the man I ordered out of my demonstration saved a system my best team could not save. Mr. Zayn Whitaker is not just the man who holds our doors. He is the man who understood how those doors actually work, when none of us did." She offered him the position of Director of Field Systems Security, with responsibility for real-world integration testing on every project before it was allowed to leave the building. It was a role that did not erase the engineers. It stood beside them and corrected for the layer they kept missing. Zayn listened, then asked his first question, the only one that really mattered to him. "Whatever schedule we agree on," he said, "has to let me take care of Matilda." "It will," Adelaide said. "More than that. We are going to build a small family room on this floor for staff who work long hours with children at home." I should have thought of that a long time ago. The lobby was quiet, but it was a good quiet now, the kind that follows something true. Zayn took Matilda's hand and walked toward the front doors. The day before, he had been ordered out of an executive corridor in front of his daughter. This morning, employees stepped aside as the two of them passed, not out of fear, but out of a respect that had finally found a place to land. Adelaide walked ahead of them, reached the heavy front door, and held it open with one steady hand. Matilda looked up at her father, the gray rabbit tucked safely under her chin. "Daddy," she whispered, "do they know now? That you're really good?" Zayn bent down, smoothed her hair, and kissed the top of her head. "It doesn't matter how much they know, sweetheart," he said. "What matters is that you always know I'm not going to leave you behind. There are people the world only sees standing outside the doors of someone else's success. But when everything inside finally falls apart, those are often the only people who know how to open the door at all."